Hello, everyone. My name is Donna Hicks, and I'm the chair of the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar. And we're delighted that we have so many participants here today from all over the world, and you're so welcome. And I know for some of you it's quite late, and for others of you it's quite early. So we so appreciate that you take the time to be with us today to hear this amazing talk that Professor Mari Fitzduff is going to be giving us. But before I move into talking about Professor Mari, I can only think of her as Mari, Fitzduff, Mari Fitzduff. Yes, I'd like to just point out that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And we have here with us, we have Nicole Bryan, who is the managing director of the Program on Negotiation. And we have James Kerwin and Diane Long. All of everyone among those people have make it possible for this seminar. So we want to give a big thanks to them right at the start. Professor Fitzduff is going to be talking about her new book, which is entitled Our Brains at War, the Neuroscience of Conflict and Peacebuilding. And, let me just say, as a member of her community, the conflict resolution and peacebuilding community, this piece of work that Mari has done and she's going to share with us today I think, is going to revolutionize our field. Because, for years and years and years, we've all known that there are major things happening in our brains when we, go to war. But what she's done is documented it. She's done extensive research, especially in the realm of neuroscience, but also in the realm of social psychology. And Herbert Kelman, I can tell you, will be so proud because, he was one of the first who talked about the social psychological dimensions of international conflict. And unfortunately, he can't be here with us today, but I know he's going to be thrilled to hear about this remarkable work that Mari Fitzduff has done and will share with us today. Let me tell you just a little bit before I introduce Mari that the format, as many of you know, is our speaker, Professor Fitzduff, will be presenting for about 35 minutes. And then after that, we will include you. We'll take your questions and please put them in the Q&A function because it will be so much easier for us to see them rather than in the chat. And let me also say that there's going to be a recording of this. We're recording, obviously, and it will be available to you in a week's time. So if you want to see that recording, go to the PON website, Program on Negotiation website, and you'll find it there. Yes, I just really want to thank everyone for helping us with this, and certainly, first and foremost, we want to thank Professor Fitzduff for this, as I said, remarkable piece of work, Our Brains at War, the Neuroscience of Conflict and Peacebuilding. This book suggests that we need a radical change in how we think about war, leadership, and politics. Most of us, political scientists included, fail to appreciate the extent to which instincts and emotions rather than logic factor into our societal conflicts and international wars. So Mari is going to be focusing on that dimension, as I said, the social psychological dimension. And I just want to tell you a little bit about her. She is a professor emerita and founding director of the Master's Professional Programs in Conflict Resolution and Coexistence at Brandeis University. Previously, she was the chair of conflict studies at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, where she was the director of INCOR, a United Nations research body examining the many ways in which conflicts can be mitigated or ended. From 1990 to 97, she was the founding chief executive of the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council, a semi-public body that funded and helped develop conflict resolution programs with government, statutory bodies, trade unions, churches, community groups, security groups, paramilitaries, prisoners, businesses, and politicians. And in 1988, along with some colleagues, she set up the Northern Ireland Mediation Network. And this network undertook the mediation of many of the necessary community and political mediations that eventually led to the Belfast Agreement in 1998. Mari worked also on the Basque Country, in the Basque Country, the Caucasus, Sri Lanka, Middle East, Indonesia, Crimea, Korea. I mean, wherever there was a hot conflict, Mari likely had her hands in trying to help mediate those conflicts. So we are just thrilled to have Mari here. And as I said, I think she's going to revolutionize our thinking about how to resolve these conflicts and how to create peace building projects as well. And the one last thing I just want to tell you about Professor Fitzduff is that she has lived these experiences. She has lived in the middle of the war in Northern Ireland. She knows this not just as a researcher. I mean, that would be enough, but this is part of her lived experience, which makes this presentation, I think you're going to be thrilled, because she's got her own personal commitment and determination that has definitely influenced her work. So Mari, I'm going to just turn it over to you, and we'll see you again in about 35 minutes.
Thank you so much, Donna, for that introduction. I feel overwhelmed. I feel so honored to be with you and with your colleagues. The work you've put in has been amazing in keeping the seminar going, not only keeping it, but developing it right through the COVID catastrophe that we've been living through. So congratulations to you all, and thank you for all of that hard work. As Donna said, I have just produced, the last few months, has just come out, a new book called Our Brains at War. In a way, I was forced to do this because there were so many questions I had, living not just in the middle of Northern Ireland, but coming and going with many friends and colleagues in many other parts of the world. And the questions that I came up with were ones that really stunned me. So often conflicts just erupted so easily. How was it neighbours had lived beside one another, and when a conflict arose, they began literally to turn around and injure and kill each other? Why were so many people willing to kill for a cause? An identity, a cartoon, etc. It just, again, how quickly this could take over people, as if there was something other than themselves who were almost deciding that this was the things they should do next in terms of their neighbors, their kin, the rest of their nation, etc. I also was struck by the fact that some people were so much more open to others, that the whole question of fearing the other was something that wasn't relevant to everybody, but it was to some people. And I wondered, was there some difference there? The other thing I was struggling with was something that you've been struggling with, I know, in the United States, the whole question of facts and why facts mattered so little in conflicts. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. Now, the reason this was important to me was that I was in the business of change, as many of you are. And if you hope to change people, nations, groups, ideas, thinking, you have to think about why they are that way. And therefore, it is definitely going to affect your theory of change in terms of why you think people will take up the gun, take up the sword, and learn to kill their neighbors. The other thing that has been so relevant over the last year or so has been living through Brexit and Trump. I lived through Trump when I was in the United States, which I left soon after he came to power. I lived in Brexit until last year, when it was eventually decided that the UK should leave, against all rationale that we could see, should leave the EU. But what was really interesting was that what happened during both of those campaigns was that they were actually appealed to by their instincts and emotions. There was very little rationale available. In Brexit, it was dominated by, as you see here, hysteria, hatred, savage emotions, and the sinister monster of exclusionary ethnic nationalism. That is very frightening for those of us who are in the business of peace building. And as Donna has mentioned, the traditional internationalist framework didn't seem to give us much answers on this. Mainly, they focus on national interests, they focus on military power, What they can't do is deal with issues of identity, inequalities, exclusions, and I know many international politics departments are having a hard time struggling with what are the major wars of today. How, for instance, could you argue with a Brexiteer, an avid Trump supporter, or indeed with a suicide bomber? One of the instances that pushed me towards neuroscience was coming across an experiment where somebody who believed passionately in something and had information put in front of him that really challenged what he believed, and his brain was wired up to an fMRI. And what happened? Did you think he would light up and understand? Did you think he would take into account the new information? No, his brain froze. Now, this was important to me because, as Donna mentioned, I was the chief executive of the Community Relations Council, which was in the business, or trying to be in the business, of change. And if people did not change just because we gave them facts, just because we argued rationally with them, how were we to go about our work? So it led me to the neurosciences, which is there something in the hardware or the software, in the genes or our biology, that affects the way that we think and behave, and often at an unconscious level? I still wonder when I look at this photograph of a brain. It is just so amazing to find out what goes happen within a brain. And I must say, I am only a novice learner. There are so many people, perhaps some of you are listening, who know much more than I do. But I was excited to see some of the limitations that we suffered in our peace building field, some of the reasons why we ended up in conflict so easily, seeming to match with some of the things that did happen in our brain. These are the various kinds of sciences that I looked at. And I also looked at the fact that by and large, a lot of these are now being used in neuromarketing. In case you don't know, every person who has got a website who's trying to sell you something probably knows more about neuroscience than you or I. Neuroeconomics, I think we have, that's been around for some years, and I think it's revolutionized the way we think about economics. Neurolaw and neurotheology, which was a new one to me when I began this book. Now, the peace building field, and I think we are beginning to wake up to the possibilities of neuroscience in our field. I think it was 2015 when I wrote my first introductory paper on this. I expected to have some challenges to it, but since I didn't, I went ahead and put together the research I've been putting together over the last year. But I have been accompanied by other people, people in MIT, people in the Beyond Violence, Tim Phillip, USIP, people in George Mason University and the University of Pennsylvania. And I want to mention here particularly Emil Bruno, who unfortunately died just last year. The other thing that was so exciting was to discover we had new tools. I am a social psychologist, so we depend so much on subjective reporting and how people feel. People say what they think. The great thing about these tools is you can't cheat. So if you say to me, I have no prejudices, I can put you, wire you up to an fMRI machine, put somebody who's somewhat different to you in front of you and see what your brain says. And by and large, your brain will have noticed. That's a reality. These are the chapters in the book. I'm obviously not going to be able to go through all of them. I've just picked out a few of them and a few of the ideas that might be interesting to you from them. And the book is available. It's available at a discount, but even still, I know academic books are quite expensive. So go to your librarian and see if you can get the library to get you one. The first thing to notice is, why do we have our feelings and instincts? And the reality is that we have them because, frankly, they serve our survival as human beings. That's where they come from. That's why they continue to exist. Some are actually embodied in our genes. I've mentioned a few of them there. By the way, the book is heavily referenced. When I had finished the book and was sending it to the editors, I had something like 74 A4 pages of references. So anything that you see in this, if you're interested in following it up, there will be the capacity for you to do that. Some of the instincts come from our hormones, different kinds of hormones. Some are environmental. I'm not going to go into the epigenetics debate, but suffice to say there is a big argument about how much of the instincts and the emotions that we have are from the environment and how much they are from our genetics and from our hormones, etc. The answer is we're still arguing. And the reality is that we often don't know that we have them, because the emotions and the instincts that power our behavior through what we call emotional hijacking are usually unconscious to us. This is probably, most of you will probably know the last few slides, so I'm going to go over them very quickly, but basically simplified, there are two main parts of our brains that we are inclined to look at in this field. And one is the amygdala, roughly, and the other is the cortex frontal lobes, roughly. The first one tends to do with feeling, the second one tends to do with abstract thinking. those of us who think that we are rational to a T, and actually most academics are, and one of the problems in this field is has been getting academics to take this up as a legitimate study, because they don't feel that they are amygdala-led. They feel that they are cortex-led. And the problem is they see the other as messy and not something that they indulge in too much, etc. However, let me say we all indulge in it, myself included. Those who've had experiences of being in love, remember the reasonness of that, losing your temper, screaming support for a football team. Wasn't that wonderful, just letting go? Being in a riot, very interesting, asking people why they were in a riot and how they got involved. The answers are fascinating. Working with a passionately committed group, which I'm sure some of you have actually done. The interesting thing is that not only do we have these different sides to ourselves, our emotional side and our rational side, but we actually are different in how our bodies respond. And this I found fascinating because it explained a lot to me. How come some people in certain situations let go of their violence, let go of their emotions much more quickly than others? Well, the scans show that we actually are different in our biology in terms of our attitudes and beliefs. And this is because our brains differ along a continuum in how we respond to uncertainty, fear, strangers, etc. There's a huge amount of references to this in my book, and indeed in so many other sciences as well. Basically, we seem to go along the continuum from those who have a larger amygdala structure and a high startle response, those who will jump even higher when there's a shot from a car, a backfire, etc. Those who have a larger amygdala response are much more likely to support capital punishment, strict immigrant control, and bigger military spending. And that actually makes sense when you think about it. There's also a gene variant that actually affects dopamine. So people with it are more likely to be open-minded people and enjoy pleasure from variety, novelty, diversity, etc. Now, if you want to be able to tell quickly where people are from, it's actually very easy. Those of you who are now enjoying Japanese food, Korean food, Thai food for years now, will find that you're in a different category to those who are still going to Applebee's, etc. You tend to be more brave and risky in terms of your choices. Child rearing, those of you who are at the end where you fear somewhat less, are happy to let your child grow without too many rules, without too much punishment. Along the other side of where the amygdala is predominant, people are more inclined to go for rules, punishment, etc. And the happiness quotient, those of you who are thinking, great, I'm liberal-minded, I'm at one end, I have to tell you that people who are at the amygdala end are actually happier generally. And that's for reasons that will become clearer as we go along. So we differ on a continuum, and you can go back and look at these slides next time if you want to. We have very little time, so I'm racing through a lot of information. This is the most fascinating slide. It's basically two scientists, Hatemi and McDermott, who decided to try and decide how much each of our beliefs owed to our genetics, to our environment, to our unique environment, etc. I can't quite believe they did it. I can't quite believe the answers they came up with, but just to show you, if you want to follow it up, how deterministic it seems to be that genetics do have a significant role. Now, the main thing to remember, we're different, but that doesn't mean for better or worse. And speculation there is that evolutionary wide, we actually needed different kinds of people. So if you're going out to chase a tiger, you need the brave person who's going to say, let me go, I see him, etc., etc. And the other person will say, hold on a moment, the spoor is not cold, it could be dangerous to go there. So we actually need a balance between those who are sort of willing to try new things and those who are conservative. And it certainly gave me a great appreciation for conservatives and why they are the way they are. The other thing is that many of us live in a state that is seemingly liberal compared to the rest of the world. And actually, this is seen as rather an evolutionary luxury because we can do it because our societies are becoming less deadly. That by and large, the more you live in a society where food is not on the table, where safety is not in any way guaranteed, the more likely you are to be anxious and the more likely you are to believe in laws and military spending, etc. And the interesting thing is concern for human rights work is often more common in developed societies because they have food and safety assured, so they can begin to think about other things. If you think in Afghanistan and how many people are living on the edge of poverty, hardly able to secure now an increased number in the last few weeks, money to survive, you can see that they're not necessarily going to have their first concern to be out about human rights work, but actually it is about what they feed their children, how they keep themselves alive. Now, we differ, as I say, in who's in charge of our brain. And I imagine I'm speaking to many people who think they are in charge of their brain, despite what I've said about our temper tantrums, etc. And I have just finished reading, I've just sort of read about half of Steven Pinker's new book, Rationality. I recommend anything by Steven Pinker. It's just come out a few weeks ago. And the first thing he says in his preface is, rationality ought to be the lodestar for everything we think or do. And all I can think is, yes, but it actually isn't. I haven't got to the end, but I'll be interested to see, are there ways in which he thinks he can ensure that we become more rational creatures? The fact is, our instincts come before our thinking. We usually haven't a choice over such feelings, and they occur half a second before conscious thinking sets in. And we often usually feel the emotion and then seek the logical reasons to uphold our thinking. You know that cream cake you look at and you think, oh, great. And you know you should go on to saying, but I'm on diet. But in fact, you go on to saying, well, maybe just this once, or I'll exercise tomorrow. So in fact, we felt the emotion, and that has taken us to itself. And therefore, we pick up that cream cake, and hang goes the diet. The other thing I've been studying, my last book was on irrational politics and why people would have voted for Trump. So I've studied it a lot. And one of the things I was interested in is the expressions of people at his meetings. When he starts to talk about actual policies, and occasionally he did, people actually leave the auditorium, they leave the room. They really aren't interested when he starts to talk about reforming Social Security, etc. It's the feeling they get when they're there, the feeling of being together as a group, their feeling together of being against other groups, and that actually what matters to them. And if you want an instance of not taking this seriously and how it can matter in an election, I think one of the things that I've understood was that there is a huge price if you don't understand this. And I point to one costly emotional mistake that was made. And that was Clinton, whom I expect many of you are supporting, off her guard, suggested that Trump supporters were a basket of deplorables. You only have to think of the feelings that actually roused in Trump supporters, who subsequently went out and got T-shirts saying, I am a deplorable. And I think that, as somebody said, Trump voters voted with their middle finger because of what they felt when that was actually said. The other thing we have to remember is that we have evolved for cooperation, and this brings up huge questions for our world. Unfortunately, only with some people. And I'll remind you, when COVID came out, was your first thought, we must send vaccines to Africa, to Asia? Probably your first thought, my family first, then my neighbors, then maybe the United States or the UK or wherever it is that you're living at the moment. So who did we share the vaccines with? I thought it was a fascinating question for us. Now, there's no wonder that we actually get together in our groups. It brings all sorts of wonderful feelings. And above all, it brings us testosterone and oxytocin. And those of you who have worked, who have played sports with teams, remember that tremendous feeling when you worked as one together. There's actually a lot of evidence from hormonal examinations that these were, in fact, hormones like testosterone and oxytocin. And they're the same ones that warriors used to have when they actually went out fighting in rear old times. And it is incredibly important to remember the role of oxytocin, because it increases a tremendous sense of belonging. It's the feeling you get perhaps when you've been together and you've been having a few drinks, or you've been listening to some music, or you've been eating together. It reduces your fear of being betrayed. You feel these people have your back. But it also promotes ethnocentric behavior, unfortunately. So in the wrong circumstances, it can actually increase our suspicion and rejection of others outside the tribe or outside the tribe. As Haidt says, what binds us, oxytocin binds us, but it also blinds us. The problem is that conflict brings out newer needs to belong. And in a conflict, a lot of other people feel that they don't quite belong. It's very interesting to find people almost going further than the people they're living with in terms of their beliefs. And it's particularly interesting. We used to have groupies in Northern Ireland who would come in to support particularly Republicans and nationalists. And they actually were harder, in a sense, to take a nuanced view, because they felt to belong, they had to feel very strongly. And this is actually one of the problems with diasporas, as you probably can remember. And you know from your work, diasporas can have a huge influence, and not just in terms of funding, but in terms of suggestions about the future, etc., to groups. And they often feel they have to belong more than people who are actually in the conflict. And I think if you look at diaspora groups such as the Tamils, if you look at diaspora groups from Israel, you'll sometimes find that, in fact, they can prevent peace actually coming about, because people feel they have to be even more fervent and radical. So those of you who do mediation, and I'll mention, you have to keep the oxytocin flowing between groups in mediation. And I'll talk about that later on and possibilities for doing that. The other thing I want to talk about is our mirror neurons and beer buddies. It used to be we thought that we related through our minds. You know, we listened to somebody, thought about, did we think the same way as they did? Actually, we don't. We have neurons in our brain that allow us to empathize with another's emotions. It's absolutely fascinating seeing the experiments that show this. They're the basis of all empathy. Of course, empathy is felt more easily for one's own group. What one of the most interesting experiments that may be relevant to you is, in terms of dialogue work, it's the group that have the most power who will feel more empathy for another group. So for instance, constantly you will find Protestants in Northern Ireland, Israelis when they're talking to Palestinians, white South Africans talking to black South Africans. They can easily feel empathy for the group they're with when they hear particularly about how badly they're doing resource-wise, etc. However, the group who has less power is less interested and doesn't feel empathy for the Israelis who talk about the bus bombs, or the Protestants who talk about the shootings along the border in Ireland. They actually feel empathy when they know the other group is actually listening to them. Now, the lesson in this is, and I have found this many, many situations I've worked in, that empathy to do work on dialogue building and relationship building actually has to be done alongside structural work that also looks at what's fair in a society, who's being excluded, who's being included. If you don't do that, it's very difficult to get the group with less power on board. And that's why I talk about the importance of what I'd say as structural work. I mean, you will notice when I will say it at the end, this is not the only way to look at conflict. It's an additional way to structural work, etc. And the reality is, I'm not showing this because I'm a feminist, which I am, but I am showing it because the capacity for empathy shows that the brain bits that are dealing with empathy are actually slightly greater in women. And that's one reason. But there is another reason. By and large, and this has been so interesting when work that I've been doing, I have sometimes had to turn down work because I was a woman and didn't feel the society I was going into would see me with enough authority. However, in many situations, you will find that women are much less threatening to the militarists, whether it's the army or whether it's the paramilitaries. And actually, they can do an awful lot of cross-cutting work, cross-cutting dialogue work. And that's one of the reasons is because they're not as frightening as they are to the enemy. They can slip in ways that many of the men can't, because men versus men often set up a different dynamic. I'm not saying I want to continue that way. I do hope women can increasingly become, and they are in certainly some political situations, Scandinavia, increasingly become powerful. Now, a lot of us are passionately committed to our own group, and that's for very good reasons. The problem is rationality and memories often become a victim to group belonging. And the thing to remember is most people actually need to belong more than to be right. And you have to take this into account when you take into account people's beliefs. We toss a lot of things about fake news, my truth, your truth around. The reality is that we inherit most of our beliefs, and maybe as a legacy of what helped our ancestors survive. When I was in Brandes, I would face a class of students, maybe a third would be Muslim, a third would be Christian, a third would be Jewish, pagan, Hindu, Buddhist, etc. And when you ask them how come their religion was different, people would start by saying because of the truth. But then when they look around, they see that the truth differed depending on where they were, depending on their location, where they came from. Beliefs are a combination of a social need to belong, a need for certainty and identity. It's very lonely when you don't have a group to belong to, which, by the way, is a problem for international students who go back, who've changed their ideas, for instance, about it being okay, LGBT people are fine, who are abortion, they might now agree with, whereas they didn't before, etc. Can be very difficult going back because you cut off your circles to which you did belong to. Neurosensitivity, the question of how much you have a startle response, how large your amygdala is, and that actually can affect your beliefs. Very interesting. I have mentioned it in the book. You actually can take people's brains and put some transcranial magnets affecting them. And you'll find that their beliefs in God and other things actually change as the magnets release them from fear. Fascinating. So beliefs often do come first, and the logic in our field is often far behind. I mentioned that when beliefs are contradicted, fMRI scans show that people might feel disturbed, but they don't increase any of their rationality. They don't take on board your thinking. So there's really not much point in spending that much time arguing with people who feel differently to you. People with high IQs aren't actually better at understanding others, but they are better at making the case for what they believe. So it's interesting to remember that people can make a very good case for what you would see as an irrational case. Our memories are faulty. We edit events, including history, to create a story that will fit our current situation, which is why when you go into a conflict zone, people are reminding you of battles that took place 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 1,000 years ago, because what they're doing is your memory actually brings together the bits that you need to make the argument that you're trying to make. And those of you who find this hard to believe, remember the last time you had a row with your partner and it went something along. You never do the dishes, and you didn't do them at Christmas either, and you didn't do it 2 years ago when I was really depending. You bring together all the arguments to make the case. So your your brain becomes flooded with the memories that you need. So don't ask why people don't change their minds. Rather ask, what will these people lose by changing their minds? Because that's often the real question. And they know that better than you. I was listening to Sam Harris, whom I listen to sometimes, and he was talking about the difficulty he is having with wood fires. Wood fires, in case you don't know, are beloved particularly by those who don't need them, who are middle class, who love to have them in their homes. Unfortunately, they've now been deemed bad for the environment, but we're finding it so hard, and I include myself, we're finding it so hard to believe it. We keep trying to find reasons why we should keep wood fires, why just a little bit of them would be okay, wouldn't it? So you can see how our feelings about fires, which may have come from our cave days, are actually making us find arguments against wood fires being actually bad for the environment. We often justify our systems. We read all the papers that confirm what we believe. We defend existing social and political and economic arrangements because they fit sometimes our psychological group needs and sometimes our material needs. And we always consider, nearly always, that the violence of our community or nation is excusable. And there's a fascinating study, go through it very quickly, where the researchers looked at 27 different nations after 9/11 and asked, 17 nations after 9/11 and asked them who carried out the attacks. Go back and have a look at this. But basically, to sum it up, it was, and when asked who was responsible, you can see the people there. None of them thought it was Arabs. Most of them thought it wasn't Arabs who carried out 9/11. It was Indonesians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Pakistanis, and that depended on their current supposed enemies or fearsome people. 43% Egyptians believed it was Israel, 36% Turks thought it was the US government, and even in the US, I think there was something like 16% didn't believe it was Arabs who carried it out. We've had plenty of this. We see the last election, 72% in 2016 believed President Obama wasn't born in the USA. Sorry, that's the wrong date, but you get it when Obama was going for presidency. 53% of Republicans now believe that Trump is the true president. And many Trump supporters believe it's Antifa or the FBI who led the assault on the US Capitol. And in Ireland, I've met loyalists who believe the Battle of the Boyne, a Protestant victory took place in 1690, is enshrined in the Christian Bible. And another one is a group called Tara, who claimed that they were Protestants, the lost tribe of Israel, and God had given them Northern Ireland so that they could get Catholics out of it by violence. And these are the sort of things we begin to believe, as it were, to shore up our cause. There's been a lot of work to show that, in fact, and the lure of extremism is much less about what people believe than about where they are and about their situation in life. What is fascinating is it is so rarely about actual religious beliefs. And one of the examples I give is a lot of the Westerners who were going to join ISIL were found to have Islam for Dummies in their rucksack. In other words, they knew very little about Islam when they actually made the choice to go and work with other fighters in Syria, etc. And it was for reasons of belonging, reasons of becoming a hero. Sometimes it was practical reasons, but nowhere where it's significantly shown that these people were psychopaths. And I think that's something that we really have to take into account. As I say, this is a photograph of the British Army and a photograph of the IRA in the early days of the conflict. And for both, you will find that many soldiers will say, and almost all the paramilitaries I asked for my PhD said that they were never more alive than when they were out on action or on their killing missions, as some might call them. And they missed being part of the active group. I was interested in finding out why they changed and stopped using bombs and bullets, and were interested now in undertaking dialogue. And they all found it hard to belong anywhere afterwards, because belonging to a paramilitary group was so meaningful to them. If you have a chance, read Chris Hedges. It's an older book. It's called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And the problem is, of course, not everybody wants peace to break out. Leaders, I won't go through it in any great length, but just I think the first line there says it all. That's from the election in 2016. My president needs bravado, somebody who is big and strong and powerful. And that often just about sums it up. Apparently, it takes about 1/10 of a second for us to decide who we support as our leader. And our choices are influenced by our genetics, brain structure, hormones, etc., etc. The World Values Survey in 2011 showed 34% of US Americans approved of having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress or elections. And the figure rose to 42% among those with no education beyond school. And there are various reasons that contribute to people who will support a dictator. But the reality is, by and large, most of us would prefer a strong leader, even if we didn't agree with the policies of the leader. Strength comes first. And perception of strength comes first. Many of you will look at Trump and think, he's not a strong leader, but many will look at him and get the feeling that he is, and that was what counted. This is probably the mismatch theory, where we actually did need strong leaders at one stage to make sure that the next tribe didn't get one over on us. But a globalizing world, it's not strength we need. And if you are frightened easily, I suggest you quickly run over the chapter that I've written on social media. Social media is horrific for our kind of work. I've given a lot of examples there about how it has determined many of the peacebuilding processes that were happening and destroyed them. And actually, it has built up dictators. It has made people support the wrong people, etc. People that turn out to be dictators, etc. The problem is that actually our circuitry is actually very addictive to social media. We can imagine an identity. If we didn't feel we belonged, we could begin to feel we belong, because we can join up with almost any group. The like-dislike button has been frightening because it suggests a really binary difference. And I'm interested to see, it's been removed by Facebook, thank heavens, on some of its sites. And just remember, if a radio helped launch a genocide in Rwanda, how much more easily it could do it. Today, how much more easily could social media do it today? The good news is that actually we do have many tendencies to cooperate. And there is a whole chapter on how these tendencies works out. We are actually primed to be altruistic. And one of the really interesting things is when we get a good feeling going along to give money to, say, somebody who is in need of money beside us, actually go with that feeling, because if you stay with it a long time, your instinct starts to fade and you'll think, well, maybe they should be on social welfare, etc. I see myself in talking about emotions, I see myself as standing on the shoulders of people like Daniel Shapiro. And I really recommend both of his books, which brought, I think, to our attention the need to consider emotions. My book is more about what's happening behind the emotions and why the emotions emerge. And I think, therefore, it's in addition to the work that Dan has done, but I really do suggest you read his. I can't go through much of how this was important to me. All that I can say is that in many of the situations I've been in, people expressing their feelings were the linchpin upon which mediations became possible and became positive. People recognizing it was the emotions within groups were a problem was also one of the reasons why people began, I had a meeting with the Moro National Liberation Front, and we helped them to realize it was the internal emotions between the different groups that was preventing them from moving on. There should be a book written about the points in international mediations when it was emotions that actually shifted how people thought about each other. Lots of examples from Rolf Meyer, Bertie Hearn, etc. And also creating possibilities for oxytocin, singing if you can, if alcohol actually work, it's not permitted in some places, but good food is certainly worth it, taking people to the hammam together, eating out late at night, etc., etc. All of these, I have examples of when these really turn the tide in mediations. Remembering that you cannot do dialogue work only with people who feel they're less powerful. You have to do structural work as well. I've talked about that diaspora work, and if I had time, I could talk about the need for public emotions. Oslo, in a sense, failed because the various communities had just not been prepared for it. We had to do a lot of work in Northern Ireland. It was just about enough to get us over the line in terms of getting people prepared. So this is my final slide, what I've come up with in terms of what I have learned. Don't base our strategies solely on reason. I know it's easier to do it. Those of you who do international politics, it's easier for you to do it that way. But actually, it's not the way it is with most of our wars today. Most of our wars, over 90%, are wars that are about, that engage people's emotions. Remember, anger and aggression often come from fear. So when you hear anger, just think for a moment and try, if you can, have conversations about what's behind it. Because truly, even with seemingly the most powerful of groups, it often is about fear. Don't bother too much with fact checking. I have seen mediations where people come in with tomes of books to show the other person was wrong in terms of their facts. Actually, you've got to think about why they believe what they say and note what they lose if they actually change their mind about their beliefs. And remember the importance of between a group. Very often you have to do single identity work with a particular group to actually make them strong enough to actually engage with other groups without becoming passionately and radicalized about their own particular perspective. Actually, people change often because they come into contact with people with whom they feel an emotional bond. And actually, they're the people you need to work with. Who do they emotionally relate to, these people that you're with? Often families, children. Pubs in Northern Ireland was a great place to actually connect with people who you really wanted to hear their opinion and suggest some new ideas. People find it very hard if they change their ideas and there's no group for them to belong to, because the change won't last. Somebody will get killed, an incident will happen, a bomb will go off, a riot will take place, and they'll feel themselves pulled back into their home group because it's too hard to stay outside. Young men in particular, we could write books about it. I've written a chapter about the whole question of violent extremism, but there is really suggestions that young men very often are availing of what they call heroic opportunities, and they need a lot more opportunities for that. Remember that peace is not an emotional gain for everyone, so don't base your work on that. And the final one that may be more important than anything else that I've said. In the years that I've been doing this research, I realized that in a sense, we are struggling with all our human natures. We're not struggling with the idea of there being bad people and good people. We're struggling most of the time with people who find themselves in bad situations. And I say to you, and I say to my class, I actually don't want people in my class who never believe that if they were faced with their children actually having their heads cut off, they too would not resort to violence. Remember that situations often determine how people behave. And if you want to see where in situations where there are laws about equality, there is inclusion, you'll find that these in fact are the more peaceful societies, tending towards the Scandinavian societies, where really by and large, they have been making opportunities for people to become part of society and to contribute to society and to be at their best in society. So remember to change those contexts. It's not just about changing people. Thank you.
Well, Mari, wow, that was amazing. There's so many things I want to ask you, but I want to give our participants a chance, but I just have one quick question. Do you have any idea what healing and reconciliation looks like in the brain?
Yes, it does. It puts it like this. You can, I'm talking about instances where I have seen a possibility of healing. And they seriously go back to the question, to the information I gave you on oxytocin. When you give opportunities for people to relax in a particular context with other people whom they cease to fear as much as they have feared, then in fact you will find that their amygdala is much less alive. That in fact the fear level is gone, the irritation, the aggravation, the instinctual, the responses are much less instinctual. And you will find that in the end of the day, what we're looking for is for that to be the nature of our societies, where by and large, we are not amygdala alert the whole time, where we actually find ourselves at a level that in fact we don't fear the people around us. We understand, we have human empathy for them. And I think we're talking about trying to move societies towards that. The only problem is that making this sustainable. And this is why you will find, for instance, making it possible. This is why I sometimes say, sometimes we laugh at ceasefires, but actually ceasefires are a very useful way for at least the day-to-day stresses and fears to actually ease just a little. So we can begin that questioning, begin that meeting that actually means we're not as alert to danger as we were before. So yes, it is. If you look at a society, you'll find their startle responses are less. You'll find that in a way they have an ease with things that are different. They have an ease with new ideas and new people. And that I think is something that can be done in many, many different ways. It's also, I mean, the information, the evidence does show that while people are fearful of others, the more they live and work on common objectives with those people who are different from them, the less they have these amygdala responses. We put them on fMRI, they hardly notice that people are different because in fact, they're thinking about other things. They've been doing other things with them. So getting people to work together in a situation where there's a common goal, where the fears are diminished, and actually it increases over a long period of time, and there is space in society for that to happen. You know, if you have a society where the only places you can go to are places that belong to one group or the other, where there's nowhere to meet, where you never meet in sport, you never meet in education, etc., then in fact, those fears are likely to continue. But if you have a society where people move easily in and out of each other's interests, in and out of each other's localities, then in fact, you begin to see a society that has begun to live more easily with each other.
Well, thank you, Mari. There are several questions here. One about fabricated facts. They're perceived as truth, and this wired to a belief system. Hence, brains are at war. Would this be an oversimplistic statement?
No, not at all. It is fascinating. It is really interesting to watch people who are, shall we say, extremists, belief extremists. They can depend very little. And in fact, they often do depend on very few statements. For instance, with the Republicans, it was, Brits out. Brits out was the simplest of statements. People lived by that, died by that, and killed by that. And make America great again. What's behind it? Do the adherents of Trump? No, not really, but they can live by that. We often need something that's very simple to live by. I mean, it's actually fascinating to see how belief systems, I'm very impressed by how, for instance, people who are Christians, people who are Muslims, who believe very strongly in a particular framework, how in a way, how they can live very easily with life because of that. So very simple statements that actually explain life to people, explain people's beliefs. They actually are very soothing. They make you certain. They make you sit more easily with life. And this is why people who are agnostic or atheists are actually more likely to have to be less happy than people who have often simple beliefs. And frankly, I don't like people who knock people's beliefs, because often they're what stands between them and the terrible situations they're in, the tragedies they have to go through. If you have a tragedy and you know that there's an afterlife, at least it makes it bearable. So I think, I'm all for beliefs that make life bearable. What I'm not for is beliefs that are so simple and include an enemy, where the enemy is very simply not you. And therefore the world has to be cleansed of people who are not you. And that's because at some level, you're really afraid that your own particular belief system might be threatened. So whoever suggested that, they are right. It can be very simple. In fact, the simpler it is, the better. It's really interesting. All the stuff on leadership shows that leaders who are complex are less likely to be voted for, because people think they maybe don't know their own minds about things. Like Obama was a tremendous person for consultation. A lot of people saw that as being not strong. So we often ask, we have very simple frameworks within which we want people to fit. And in some ways, one of the ways you can tell this is if you're in a conflict, no matter which conflict it is, you like things to be simple. So often the people who are killed are the people who are nuanced, the mixed marriages, the people who cross the borders, the people who refuse to take the simplicities. They are often killed first because they're the ones who are saying, maybe it's not as simple as this. So yes, living by simplicities is unfortunately very comforting, very useful for some people, but in our field, it can be the death of many.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mari. Here's another question from Peter. Would you differentiate between empathy and compassion? And is there evidence in your research for this difference?
Compassion is something that there's been a lot of arguments about. And whether it differs from empathy depends on the circumstances. So for instance, if you meet somebody and feel empathetic towards them, let's imagine you are an Israeli who's meeting somebody from Gaza, and you hear what their life is like, and you feel empathy, and you think they have so much more materially than we have. When it comes to compassion, compassion might mean actually something active on your part. And therefore, this part of you might think, but there's not much I can do about it. So compassion is something that can suggest an activity. Empathy doesn't necessarily suggest an activity. And there is actually interesting, there have been books written about compassion. And sometimes we substitute compassion, thinking we have empathy with people as being enough, But of course, you know, there are several things. You actually can only live with so much compassion. You can actually disable yourself by being compassionate. If you read the newspapers in the morning and try to be compassionate with every person that suffered. So yes, there is a difference in the sense that I think there seems to be more of a question of activity around the compassion. Empathy is more something that can be mirrored in your mirror neurons, but they're very, very near to one another, and they all depend on the particular context and the particular circumstances.
Yeah, it might be that you need empathy in order to be compassionate. Who knows? Here's another one from Sarah. Dr. Fitzduff, do you believe that the world is becoming more violent or less violent?
The world is becoming much less violent. You'll be glad to hear. Good news of the day. If you want a book to read, I suggest you read Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Human Nature, a huge tome, wonderful book. He basically goes through all the figures in terms of violence and shows that, and actually it's interesting because I live in Ireland where there are castles everywhere. And it wasn't until I read Pinker's book that I understood these castles used to be for tribes who fought each other, and they were often only a few miles away from each other. So often it was tribe against tribe. You could have dozens of tribes in their castles waiting for the next warlord of warmongering people to come and take over their castle. Now, eventually what happened was those castles grew further apart, and now you'll find that the whole place here is more or less joined in being a nation. There's complications in Ireland, but let's take the Republic of Ireland. It sees itself as a nation against another nation. So in fact, the whole question of violence has become much more obvious. And they also have done a lot of, Pinker's work is very interesting. They've done a lot of work on how people died to show that by and large, more people died through violence proportionately, a lot more in eons ago than they do these days. And he gives very interesting reasons as to why that actually is so. I do suggest that you read it, because for those of us who feel depressed, it actually is something to look at. He also points out that by and large, we are also getting better. You know, 1 billion people have been taken out of poverty in the last 10 years, that we are getting better in terms of our empathy and compassion for the rest of the world. However, there is something in us that often finds it difficult. I'm aware that when you bring up statistics to people who think that they have been excluded and are unequal to others, etc., you often can get a validation by actually being a victim. And you often don't want to move on too quickly from that. So sometimes you can find, as in some situations, some countries, you get two sides deciding that they are victims and refusing to accept that the other side is one. So the whole question of victimology is an absolutely fascinating one. the whole question of how you deal with people who feel themselves to be victims and who refuse and find it hard to move out of that so that they can actively change the conflict, as it were. So that's another interesting side in terms of has the world got better. But yes, I promise you this book will take all the doubts that you have away about whether the world is more violent or not. One of the reasons we think it is violent is if you remember Idi Amin, you'll probably do, I'm old, so I remember Idi Amin. We hardly knew anything about Idi Amin and the thousands, the millions that he murdered and the people who had to leave Uganda. Now we would hear about that every day. So in a sense, the news brings to us all the bad news. And by our nature, we listen to the bad news. And those of you who want to disagree with that, do you not remember when Bush went into Iraq? Do you not remember how we sat by our televisions waiting to see what was going to happen? We too are part of the seduction, as it were, of the excitement of war. And that's something that we have to mind. But yeah, we're getting better. Let's hope we continue to.
So Mari, here's another question. How does the release of oxytocin or dopamine compare in the virtual space versus in person? I love this question. Can mediations in the virtual space still achieve the level of bond that in-person mediations have in the past?
I'm tempted to say yes, because it's all we have at the moment with many situations. I've looked at some of the research in this, and it suggests the answer is no, not in the same way, not in the same bodily way that we do when we meet in person. That doesn't say that virtual mediations can't work. It just means that there are things that you cannot have as easily available to you as you can if you actually are in person. I mean, as someone who has done a lot of mediations in person, it's so easy to note the emotions in a room, to suggest things that can sort of release that oxytocin, that can increase the good feelings. It's much harder to do that. You know, you can say, okay, let's stop for a cup of tea or coffee, but you've no idea what's going on with the groups in the different contexts that they're in. So it's hard. And I think now we're probably talking about having a mixture of both, but I do think that there still should be made resources and funds available for mediation that happen in person. And can I make a plea here? One of the things I found is that funders often don't understand that when you're doing mediations, you need money not just for the hours when the mediation is happening, not when people are just talking about things. I've had mediations almost destroyed by funders who said, what? You're going to have that many hours for going for a boat ride on the Bosphorus or doing this or that, and trying to explain to them this is just as important. The evidence on mediations is it's often in the corridors and outside the sessions that things happen between people that make success possible. I mean, we had one here in our own situation in Ireland where the Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, had to leave the mediation because his mother died. He left for 2 hours and came back. Now, in Irish terms, that is a huge sacrifice because we value wakes and funerals so much. And the other side actually felt he really must have been committed to it. And a lot of things happened because of that. So yeah, I think it's not enough just to have Zoom mediation, and I think we will have to have a mixture of both.
Okay, here's the last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Bryant for us to close us. Mari, what about shame? How does that affect our brain?
I haven't actually looked at the literature on shame, but there is literature that shows people who feel that they are excluded, who feels that they are treated badly and unfairly. And there is a lot of evidence to show not only do they feel that in their bodies, as well as in, you can actually put them on an fMRI and you will see their bodies reacting. In fact, it's not just it's not just humans who feel this. I've looked at some interesting experiments between monkeys who felt that they were being not validated, who felt they weren't getting as much as the next monkey. And actually you see similar reactions in their bodies as well. So we need to be incredibly important. You know, somebody used to say words don't hurt you, but the fact is that words hurt a hell of a lot. So shaming somebody, making them feel inferior, making them feel excluded, all of those hurt our bodies. And the long-term consequence can actually be disastrous in terms of depression, anxiety, etc.
Well, Mari, I just personally want to thank you for an extraordinary hour here. And thank you for everything that you're doing, and keep it up. keep going, because you said you were always learning. So always share it with us too, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole.
Yeah, I can only echo Donna and Mari. Thank you so much. What a pleasure it is. And you can tell it's such a pleasure because I look at the participants, everything they've been chatting, at the esteemed group of folks that we have had on this chat. So I would encourage everybody, please go look for the book, Our Brains at War. We put the link in the chat. We will have a link up to the recording of this session, which will have closed captioning options in about a week on the PON website. So please continue to check in. Please stay in touch with PON for, of course, all of the events that we offer throughout the semester. And coming up, Mari mentioned Dan Shapiro. In exactly 3 weeks from today, Dan Shapiro will be doing a one-day session on emotions as you negotiate. It is a really great opportunity to learn from one of our faculty. So we really encourage you to attend, and we look forward to seeing you throughout the semester. We've got great things coming up in the Kelman seminar and at PON Live. So thank you to everyone for being here today, and have a great rest of your evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye, and thank you.